We made a lot of progress since yesterday. The lights aren't too bad, and I got a podium. I can put my notes down. We get things right eventually, so that's good. Thank you for waiting around for us until the meeting ended. As I think you know, we had a whole lot of the best players in the world here. The last count I saw, I think, was 283. It may have actually been a little higher than that. And the first thing I want to say, and it's probably the most important thing from a personal standpoint that I would want to say, is when you look at this group of players, and you want to pan over there, you can see a large number of other ones over there too, is that they asked me a couple of years ago to be part of this group and to help them negotiate an agreement that they thought would be fair and appropriate. And for me to be a part of this team is an absolutely extraordinary privilege and an extraordinary honor. And I just wish everybody could have that feeling. I can't really put it into words. And when we go through meetings like we had over the last, since last night and through today, the last 18 hours or so, and you get a real sense of the unity and the commitment and the participation and the understanding and the knowledge that these players have, it's very gratifying. You don't get to do this on behalf of people like this very often in your life. And it means a lot. In terms of the bargaining, first of all, there have been no developments since yesterday. The players very much want to reach an agreement, provided that it's one which is fair and which is equitable and treats them appropriately. We approach it as we always have, one day at a time. If you don't find an agreement today, you hope tomorrow you'll find a way to make an agreement, and if that doesn't work, you get up the next day and think about it some more. We don't have artificial deadlines. Obviously, the subject of a potential lockout starting at 12:01 a.m. Sunday morning came up during the meeting, and there was a fair amount of discussion about that. The only thing that needs to be said at this point is that if it comes to that, it's a choice which was made or is being made as we speak. It's not a requirement. It's not something anybody has to do. If that's the way it's going to be, then unfortunately that's the way it's going to be. But if we're interested in trying to find a way to reach an agreement and to make sure that the NHL goes forward with the players and that the fans don't lose any hockey games, then maybe it's a choice that ought to be reconsidered. Players approach this process with several principles in mind. And I talked about these a bit yesterday, and I'll just reiterate them very briefly. That given the dispute which occurred 7 or 8 years ago, whichever it was, I forget now, in which the players ended up agreeing to the salary cap that the owners wanted, with what can only be described as enormous concessions to the owners, followed by a period of time in which revenue grew more than 50% to on an HRR basis, which is not all revenue, as you know, it's hockey-related revenue, of approximately $3.3 billion. The proposals we have seem to suggest that the owner's view is that having gotten all these concessions and having raised all this additional revenue, the appropriate thing to do is see what else they can get. And you'll have to make your own judgments as to whether that's a fair or appropriate or equitable way to proceed. We haven't ignored the owners. Far from it. We have proposed that under these circumstances, we could construct an agreement in which, as revenues grow, the players' compensation would be protected, but it would grow significantly more slowly than revenues, in an effort so that after a few years, the league could grow out of any perceived difficulties that it had. It does require the owners to grow revenues. That's their job. The players' job is to play the game in the way the fans want. And we think everybody needs to do their part here. Second, I want to reiterate the way we look at this. If there are areas of the NHL, franchises and ownership groups that need assistance, the players are prepared to take these salary concessions that I mentioned as revenues grow and partner with the higher income teams to provide whatever assistance is needed. So far, at least, we don't have any indication of a willingness to do that. The concessions the owners want apply more or less equally to Toronto and Phoenix, and I don't pick those two teams out except by way of example. The third thing that we are interested in is what you might call shared sacrifice. If there is going to be sacrifice here, the players are going to take less money than the current agreement provides them in terms of the players' share. Then the question is, are they the only ones whose compensation and circumstances are to be limited or reduced? Is there any other cost or expense anywhere in the NHL, National Hockey League Enterprises, any team, or anywhere in which the owners are prepared to say, we'll constrain these expenses too? So far, the answer to that appears to be no. And that raises the fundamental question again as to whether the approach that's being taken is one which is fair or equitable, or which is reasonably calculated to lead to an agreement as opposed to a dispute. I was asked the following question by the players a lot yesterday, and it came up today, and it is the most obvious question when you look at the proposals in front of us, which is, what's in this for the players? What do they get out of this agreement? In the last agreement, at least there was significant movement in the players' direction on the player contracting issues, things like salary arbitration and free agency. But what's on the table now appears to say we have to have the salary concessions all over again, plus we have to go in the owner's direction on all the player contracting issues and undo that portion of the last agreement either. Less money, fewer rights. I think everybody understands why the owners would like that. Every employer would like that. I have a more difficult time understanding why anybody would expect the players to make an agreement on that basis. And I think the last thing that I would say is this. When the owners made their initial proposal to reduce salaries 24% and eliminate all these player contracting rights, players had a choice. We could have responded in kind. We didn't. We said let's try and find a way to make an agreement. So we moved towards them. And their position so far appears to be that they moved very far away from the players and are slowly inching back. What do I mean by that? Well, when fully implemented, the players' share under their initial proposal would be reduced 24%. And the current proposal is to reduce it only 17.5%. That's all. So what I would ask all of you that are sitting in the audience listening to me, and anybody that watches what you produce or reads what you write, listens to what you say, to ask the following question: what would your reaction be in similar circumstances? And that's the way I think you need to understand the dispute, which hopefully will not end up in a dispute. That would be when a shutdown occurs, but the disagreement that we have. So let me come back to where I started. I don't want there to be any disagreement about or any misunderstanding about this, or I don't want to be less clear in any way than is needed. The players want to find a way to make an agreement. They want to negotiate until we do. And what we hope is that we get a response on the other side which says, what kind of proposals does it take to find a way to reach an agreement, and not simply repeat what seems to be the pattern in all the cap sports, whether they claim to be in distress, as hockey was 7 years ago, 8 years ago, or whether there's no claim of distress and no one would believe it anyway, like the NFL was in. It doesn't really matter. It is, let's propose much lower player salaries and then lock the players out. That's the question. Last point. We would like an agreement that stabilizes this industry, provides incentives for the markets which need to grow, and gets us out of the cycle that we've been in this sport. That's the overall long-term job, and that's what we'd like to try and do. So with that, if there are any questions, I'll try and answer them. Yes?
In terms of the actual dollar figures, how big is the chasm between the players and the owners? I've heard anything from like $1 billion over 5 years. Are you able to put it into like a ballpark number?
I haven't actually looked at it in that fashion. We'd have to do some work on it. But you can start with the proposition that on this last year's numbers, a 17.5% reduction is somewhere in the neighborhood of $330 million per year. And every chart I have looked at suggests that under any of the owners' proposals or any of the potential growth rates, the amount of money that the owners would receive as a result of the salary reductions is in excess of $2 billion over 5 or 6 years. So it's a lot of money. Yes? Chris. Yes?
Don,
Where am I looking?
will you ask the owners to reconsider on their decision to enact the lockout if there's no deal in place on Sunday?
Will we formally ask? They know what our position is. If it would help to ask and they would say yes, sure, we'll ask. You know, but they know what the position is. Yes?
Don, given what the owner's position has been all along, do you feel you guys have done enough to convince them of what they'll be losing if they go ahead and lock you out? Have you created leverage that they perceive as a threat?
Sorry about that. I think the perception is this, and I hope I'm wrong about this. First, that hockey is poised, I think, to really move over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years to a fundamentally different place than it has been before. And the question is whether the disagreement we're now having is going to screw that up. If so, that's bad and that's unfortunate. We ought to be doing what we can to avoid it. But the perception we have sometimes is that all they're interested in is in talking about salary reductions. That's all I can say. Yes?
Were any votes conducted on any issues or points in these 2 days?
No. But you can ask, you can ask the guys if they think there's any significant disagreement.
Many people have been saying in the last few days that that the two sides were speaking different languages. Do you feel like, since they don't seem to be very open with your ideas of revenue sharing, that those differences in philosophy should have been discussed maybe more when you look at it in retrospect, that maybe there should have been more discussions beforehand instead of coming to this point at crunch time?
There's no lack of discussions going on. They understand fully what the positions are and why we think it would be appropriate and all the rest of it, why we think the revenue sharing structure we've suggested would actually spur revenue growth in those markets. There's no misunderstanding about that.
Don, Gary said yesterday that this offer is going to be rescinded once the Saturday deadline.
Yeah, he's told me that too.
Does that deadline impact what you guys are willing to offer as well?
Yeah, it may. It depends on what happens after Saturday. As I say, we take it one day at a time. Take it one day at a time. You know, everybody's free to reconsider their proposals at any given point in time. And if the owners do that, at least obviously that's on the table for the players too. One of the questions that needs to be asked is whether, if indeed they lock out, and whether, if indeed they do that, that is reasonably calculated to make a deal more likely or less likely. I think you can figure out the answer. Yes?
We've been through this a number of times. A great show of solidarity in here. What value do you place on public sentiment in a situation like this?
Obviously, the fans have an interest in this. Obviously, they are the ones who, in the end, are the customers, if you will, if you look at it from the point of view of economics. Obviously, we would like them to understand. Obviously, we would like them to the extent possible, to agree with what the players' positions are. That's why we spent the time talking to them. That's why we've tried to explain our positions. Having said that, the positions that you take in bargaining are the function of an informed series of judgments that you make based on people who have the information. So I guess it's both. But you know, to the extent that fans believe that a lockout, if it begins, would be inappropriate, they should be saying that.
With so many teams in the league that are hurting some of those smaller markets, southern markets, if you will, are you surprised the NHL hasn't embraced your plan to kind of help those teams with that revenue sharing that you talked about?
A little bit surprised, significantly disappointed.
What are the chances that you will make a new offer Friday or Saturday?
I've got no comment on that. If negotiations continue and it looks like we're getting somewhere, obviously we'll do all we can to push those negotiations along. We have to wait and see what happens after the owners' meeting. I'm sure the sides will be in contact.
Down here, right in front.
Okay. The reason I'm looking around is that the sound doesn't come from where you are.
That's okay. So. It's okay. Obviously, it's not your first rodeo. Do you feel like you're in 1994 where you were with baseball, or how would you compare it on the scale of, you know, Armageddon versus
you're
something
bringing
else?
back my Kansas roots, talking about my first rodeo. So I'll just put that off to the side for a moment. But the answer is I hope not. Because what happened in baseball in 1994 is really pretty simple. The owners decided the only thing they could agree upon is that the players should take a lot less money, and that would make them all feel better. And that was sort of the only position they could hold to until the dispute went on for a very long time. I hope that's not the case here, but I'm not the person you need to ask about that.
Don, over here. 3 months went by years ago after the lockout was commenced and before the two sides met again. What's your sense of wanting to continue the dialogue and obviously not wait that long before there's some kind of tangible progress?
There's two competing issues there. As I said before, you get up every day and you want to try and find a way to reach an agreement. Talks are not likely to be productive unless both parties are ready to do that. Otherwise, you're just sitting there replowing old ground and aggravating one another. So our position will be, once a lockout begins, that we're not going to walk away from discussions. We'll certainly be prepared. If we have anything new to say, we're not going to stand on ceremony. Hopefully they'll be on the same page. But I think it's very difficult what to predict if indeed we get there. You know, I would still like to believe we won't.
Don, we're over here, in front.
In front. Okay, when you say over here, it still comes out of the speakers. I still don't know where you are.
You talked about breaking the cycle of having these negotiations every time a CBA comes up and the threat of a lockout. How do you convince the owners that your plan would do that, and why do you think they haven't bought in so far?
Well, first of all, you keep trying. You try and do it, and you point to examples where it has had that effect. And I've said this before, I don't know how many of you have heard me, but there's only, from a labor relations standpoint, there's only one sport that's been stable for the last decade and a half, and that's baseball. And that's not unrelated to the collective bargaining structure, which is there. But I guess the only answer I can give you is you keep trying. You know, we're not dealing with stupid people on the other side. They know what they're doing. They're smart. They can think. And hopefully over time we'll be able to find some common ground. I hope the time doesn't take very long. Tonight would be nice.
Don, to your left, what other costs do the players think the owners can contain? What other costs do the players think they should contain, and have you made a specific proposal?
We have not made a specific proposal. We have talked to them about some of those, and I'm hopeful that when they look at it, sooner or later they would say, okay, if there's going to be some sacrifice, there should be some shared sacrifice. But we have not made a specific proposal in that regard.
Are you talking about coaches, executives, or arenas, or travel?
We're talking about potentially any cost other than the player's share.
Hey, Don, some teams, I'm sure you're aware, have started to send out letters to their season ticket holders saying, you know, this thing is coming up and, you know, you should do this. And is it a move that should be interpreted as something that they saw coming, almost want to have?
You'll have to make that judgment. I certainly hope it isn't true. If you want to have something and if you plan for it, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. And I hope that's not the case. You know, you'll have to make your own judgments based upon what you see and what's happened in similar circumstances in this sport and other sports.
Don, over here to your left and back here. Back here.
There you go.
I'm curious, what did you, as both informer and observer, get a sense of the players in terms of how they felt? Is it frustration? Is it determination? Is it curiosity? What did you sense in the room these past 18 hours?
All of those, absolutely. Sure, they're frustrated. They would like an agreement. You do not get to this level in this sport, and I think probably goes for the elite level in any team sport, unless this is what you want to do almost as much as you want to breathe. So of course they're frustrated. Of course they'd like this done. Of course they'd like it over and they can get back on the ice. That's what they want to do. No athlete likes to lose games. The question is, and maybe you ought to factor this in, if they are willing to, there must be some pretty powerful reasons.
Don, right in front of you, down here. If the players' belief is that after the concessions the last time, you shouldn't have to give back more money in a sport which is growing, you believe will continue to grow, and the owners seem to reject that, they seem to believe that this is concessionary bargaining and you guys are going to have to give up something, how do you get to where you want to be? What's a win for you if the owners refuse to believe that this is anything other than a situation where you need to give something back?
You keep bargaining until you find a way to bridge that gap. That's about the best answer I can give you.
Don, to your left. Bottom line, these guys want to play hockey. That's ultimately the bottom line. So assuming there is a lockout, have you offered an opinion or advice on some of the opportunities these guys should be considering outside of the NHL, European options, some of the things that these players have, you know, opted for in the past?
You should remember one thing. First of all, I don't talk about conversations with players. They have a right to have those considered confidential. They can talk about them if they want, but I work for them, so it doesn't work the other way. The second thing is you should assume that all aspects of what might happen in the event we get into that situation come up and are discussed at various times and places.
Don, in front here. Don, obviously from baseball, you know, the culture there, the union culture there is so strong, kind of forged in conflict. Is there any sense of any consideration on your part that there's an advantage, a benefit to having these guys locked out and kind of...
Oh, that's preposterous.
Building your union.
That's preposterous. You don't build a union by having work stoppages. You build a union by negotiating appropriate agreements.
Yeah, although
and that's what we're trying to do here. Nobody has an interest in shutting down the game if there's a way to avoid it by negotiating an appropriate contract.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Sorry. Don, if you know, the league has said that their offer will not be this good past Saturday night, if this is a prolonged impasse, so far you've stayed within the current system in your proposals. Would you consider going after the salary cap if this becomes a prolonged affair?
What I have said before, and the only thing I'm prepared to say now, is that if we get past that point, then the players are as free to reconsider their positions as the owners are. That's all I can tell you. All right? Thanks very much, and I hope this worked better than yesterday.